Hey legends, I hope that you're all doing well. I've been off for a couple of days, but I still monitor the absolute ridiculousness of the independent propagandists online. Now, my voice, well, it's gotten actually worse to the point where I can't use any of the voice features on my phone because it just doesn't pick up what I'm saying. And as well, I was trying to speak to one of those like robot things like on the phone where you press 1 for this and I need to talk and it just wouldn't pick it up. So it's not great. If you've got any tips for this, it'd be great, because after 3 months, it's getting pretty bad. It's getting to the point where I'm actually really, really struggling to keep on track with things because of how much it's hurting. But enough of that. Now, I've been trying to increase my reading comprehension and some more knowledge around some of the related topics I talk about, as you can't ever be too knowledgeable on a subject, and I'm the bottom rung of that. But I've been reading a lot and talking to many very well-rounded military-minded mates. Now, we've seen a lot of drones over the past couple of days operating both in Ukraine and Russia, and this is further cementing that drone warfare in modern conflict is absolutely where we're heading, if not we're already there. And there's been strikes and interceptions of these strikes over the past 24 hours throughout Ukraine and even in Moscow and Russia. Now, Russia seems to be trying to exhaust Ukrainians' air defence systems with basically daily barrages of both missiles but also these cheap drones that we're seeing. And while the drones that struck Russia are either a false flag job from inside Russia to support, further mobilisation of the civilian population, or further strikes as Putin has promised mirror actions, or again it was an attempt to actually strike Moscow from the Ukrainian side to collect intel on maybe the Russian air defence, maybe hit some targets, but we're not really sure. And will we ever exactly know? We just won't. But the usual blue tick propagandists have jumped to the conclusions with a video that was showing a drone that was actually just a civilian Cessna just flying around. Although I will say, anywhere where there's air defence, I would not be flying a civilian aircraft. There's been enough military aircraft since air defence has existed to get shot down by friendly air defence. Air defence is not 100% on either friend or foe. But anyway, there's another video that people are saying is a Ukrainian UJ-22 drone, which is basically a surveillance drone made in Ukraine by UKR Jet. Although the photos show a very different platform with small wings, canards at the very front. So it appears not to be a Ukrainian-made UJ-22. And to me, it looks more like the Iranian-made or designed Abadil 2. But let me know what you think. But Russia claim all of these were intercepted either by force or electronic warfare. And EW, electronic warfare, that's not something we talk about enough. And there's been a lot of people over the recent from RUSI, RUSI, being where they do a big think tank, and I'll have a quote about this, but that Russia has intercepted 10,000 Ukrainian drones a month, and this goes both ways. I've talked to a few friends that work in this space that talk about the amount of EW, the amount of electronic warfare operating near the front lines is dramatic. Why doesn't it get the airtime other things do? Well, EW is typically the secret or top secret, and it's not as sexy for the media. Delivering an F-16. Look at my video thumbnail. I'll have an F-16. If I had a fucking antenna, no one would give a shit. And this is that media thing. But the electronic warfare also that Ukraine is using under supervision of the West as well, that I'm hearing from my sources, is huge and having a huge effect. But also the electronic warfare used from the Russian sources is also very good and can intercept basic things up to higher level equipment as well. And that was just some open source stuff given to me off some mates. But what will exhaust first? I think this is one of the big questions that needs to be asked. What's going to exhaust first? Is it going to be Ukrainian air defence or Russia's drones and missiles? Well, each side will say that they know the answer. But truthfully, no one knows at what rate Russia can produce these and what the West can give Ukraine these amount of stuff. Pro-Russian accounts will claim they've shot down everything from HIMARS, Storm Shadows, bloody everything that has been sent their way, while pro-Ukrainian accounts will claim Russia is running out of missiles 12 months ago, as we've seen more and more of a movement towards the drones. But is this because they're running out of the missiles, or that the drones are far cheaper doing a similar job? And we're going to see a big transition, I believe, away from a lot of expensive equipment to more cheaper equipment. Would you rather have, 1,000 swarm cheap DJI drones or handmade ones or one, Predator. I don't know. It's depending on the mission, but it's a way that this is going to go forward as well. Now, is replacement rate meeting the rate of use on either side? Now, this is something that we don't know. The US, over the period that they've had the Patriot missile system, has developed about 10,000 rockets. Now, do them all exist? No. Are all of them fireable? No. How many are in rotation? We don't know. How many can they actually produce? Some people are throwing the number out of 200 a year, but I'm sure that can be kicked up or bought from another area. We're not really sure. How many missiles, drones, things like that can Russia make independent of Iran, or can Iran make and get through to Russia in different aspects? This, of course, as well, we don't know. Numbers are thrown out there, but truthfully, we don't know. This is what I've talked about in length, that if China were to get involved, that adds a whole nother basket that we add to this, because their rate of production in China is insane. Look around your room, look around this room. Everything here is made in China. We know that they can just make stuff. Can they make the most high-tech equipment? No, that's why we make chips in Taiwan and equipment in America and Germany and things like this. Can they produce stuff? Can they produce these basically dumb drones? Can they do whatever? Absolutely. So that lethal aid would be a massive shift on that front. But I won't go on about that because I could forever. But the question on everyone's minds is, when will we start seeing counteroffensive? Now, in my opinion, and opinions shared amongst some of my peers, we are already seeing it, have been seeing it for weeks. But these are in smaller operations, often being called shaping operations that posture the Ukrainian troops in the best way for then a push. And this is also to probe the Russian lines, whether with men, drones or fire, to collect intelligence on where are the built-up defended areas, what are the locations of equipment, and even down to what is the response time. So I fire a bomb in here, how quickly till one gets back? Or if I hit this, how long until a quick reaction force can get there? So even things like that, if I shoot here, how long do these troops take to wake up, get ready, and then man their pits? Even things down to this. This is all a factor. Now, as new Western conventional equipment and training is being adopted into the Ukrainian military, everything from tanks, vehicles, now planes, although we're not going to see these planes in this offensive, we know that much unless it's at the very end of the year. But as speculation grows around the effectiveness of these counteroffensives, with some officials saying it will just be limited to success, all the way to officials adamant that Crimea will be liberated and cleared by the end of the year, although we have spoken in length about some of the problems with that as well. Now, Zelensky has said only in the past 24 hours, we have approved the dates for the start of the movement of our troops. The decisions have been made. I thank the brigades that prepared for this. So we're talking about those guys that have been trained in the West, trained by NATO standards, and also the equipment that has come across. And there is two ways too. These operations where we're training these guys maybe to get to a better level of training, there's also an absolute lack of any conventional warfare experience in Western militaries. Think about the last time the West fought a proper conventional war. The experience doesn't exist, and that experience goes both ways. It is very handy for that as well. So don't think that the information is just going one way. It's absolutely flowing both ways. Yes, there's hands-on skills, firing, shooting, moving, blah, blah, blah. But experience is one of those things. And even the units, when I was leaving, and I left in 2021, the last real combat ops were maybe 14, 15, and finding a guy who had been involved in even those combat operations against, Taliban, low, difficult, and that's throughout armies everywhere. So this flow of information is both ways and important both ways. Don't think that they're not getting anything back out of this, although it may not look like tangible skill. Anyway, people are more expecting, other than what we talk about these counteroffensives, we believe they're already launched. People are really expecting a big launch towards the Russians soon. You're talking tanks and artillery and planes and all this, pushing all abreast and sweeping through. But what if I told you some equipment could actually be counterproductive if not implemented not only in scale, but also the reliable, efficient logistics? There is absolutely this equipment trapped in warfare that has been the undoing of many greater size forces time and time again throughout history, from the time we had bow and arrows to the time now we have electronic warfare and tanks. Ukraine's strength against Russia in the beginning was its ability to conduct what they call asymmetrical warfare against these large Russian pushes. This strength is what could be undone by now how countries have equipped their fight and plan missions, if not used to the best advantage. Now, we're going to go over exactly what all this is. I know it might be confusing. Now, But I will say I'm using this as a think tank, and I've been thinking on these ideas for a couple of days, and I'm absolutely happy to be wrong. I'm as happy to be wrong as I am to be right. I think more people should be open to changing our minds as new information or someone with more experience comes up and fills us in on something, and we should be happy to swing our minds on even things down to our core. So I always say that with I'm happy to change even my views on the most set in things. You should be willing to do that if you can be proven one way or the other. But I'm using this as a think tank, bounce ideas off me to you and you to me. And I know also there's a lot more clever people with far more military backing experience than I do out there planning this stuff and how this is going to go down. So bear with me. Now, the war is very cloudy with what is actually happening day to day. But let's take it back to pre-22 Russia and Ukraine. In an open battlefield in a conventional battle of air, land and sea, Russia hold the advantage 10 times out of 10, not only by numerical numbers, but superior equipment. But this is the same we had with soldiers operating in Afghanistan. We held the advantage in all aspects of equipment and training. So why was it so difficult and ultimately not being worth the cost? Now, there is a Taliban saying, you have the watches, but we have the time. And this is really the theory of asymmetric warfare. Now, I'm somewhat versed in this as an Australian soldier because Australia has a very small military and relies on this almost guerrilla-style warfare to counter a much larger force. For example, attack on the north of Australia. We would somewhat let the opposing force have the north, sorry about that, Darwin, but then do small hits on logistics as they try and then move further south. And the whole idea of this is good luck moving tanks, fuel, water for troops across basically 4,000 kilometres of desert. Hey man, Robbie's in here laughing at me. Yeah.
We're going to go buy guns from pawn shops tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. And then conduct the clearing operations from there, basically cutting off the logistics and letting them then burn themselves out. So what, by definition, actually is asymmetric warfare, and how is this relevant? Well, as always, I have things to tell you about, and I've also got an intel update in here as well that I think relates back to this. But asymmetric warfare refers to a type of conflict where there is significant imbalance in military power, resources, or capabilities between the opposing parties. In such a scenario, the weaker side, often a non-state actor, but sometimes can be, or a less technologically advanced force, adopts unconventional tactics and strategies to compensate for its disadvantages and challenge the stronger adversary. So in this, when we're talking the beginning of the war, because there's so much fog now with what is actually going on, but we're talking the at least the larger side, this imbalance between Russia and Ukraine. This is why people thought it would fall very quickly. But we can see that asymmetric warfare balances these scales completely out. We'll keep going in this. Unlike conventional warfare, which typically involves two or more state actors engaging in direct, large-scale battles using established military doctrines, asymmetric warfare involves tactics that exploit vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the more powerful opponent. And have a look at this. Where is Ukraine exploiting vulnerabilities? They're exploiting ideology. I think they're exploiting people's want for democracy. So they're exploiting that within Russia, going, you look at what we've got over here in the West, you could have that. So exploiting things like that. They're also exploiting some of the problems that come with a big force. You have to have fuel, you have to have tanks where they can move into an area with a javelin, take that out and leave. You've only got two guys, you can move in and out quickly. Think about some of the weaknesses of a large thing and the vulnerabilities that they then pose. You have a much larger footprint on the ground. Russia in the beginning, 40-mile convoy, massive footprint. Guys, two guys with a fucking in-law, walk in, walk out. The guys we've seen walk across the border into Bryansk. Things like that. Okay, I digress. Some common characteristics and strategies associated with asymmetric warfare include guerrilla tactics. Weaker forces may employ hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage, and other irregular warfare techniques to disrupt the enemy's operations and inflict damage. Now, my background in the army, I'm an infantry guy, was what they call DFSW, but direct fire support weapons, and then turned into anti-armour. Now, the anti-armour went from, basically having Carl Gustav 84mm to, and I wasn't in at this point when they did this, but they basically went to full ghillie suits with Javelin or 84mm and went on tank hunts. They were basically operating as snipers, but with an anti-tank weapon. Could roll out the weaker force, numerically weaker against a tank, and kill one or two tanks. But because they're so small, they're in ghillie suits, don't give off a big footprint at all. In, out, and leave. Now, number two is insurgency and terrorism. Non-state actors may resort to insurgency tactics, aiming to gain control over specific territory, challenge the existing government, or create instability. Terrorism involving the use of violence against civilians or non-combatants is another strategy employed to achieve political or ideological goals. So let's look at this first one, the non-state actors to insurgency tactics. Have a look at what happened in Belgorod and Bryansk when these non-state actors were talked about non-state actors being just a raised militia, then moved into Russian territory to gain control over a specific area, and then they challenged the existing government in that. So it went from Belgorod and people saying Belgorod. Now that was only took place over 24, 48 hours, but it had a massive effect. This was why asymmetrical warfare is incredibly hard to counter. Now, number three, unconventional weapons and methods. Asymmetrical warfare can involve the use of unconventional weapons such as IEDs, bombings, or cyber attacks. These methods are often cost effective and create significant disruption despite the limited resources of the weaker party. Now, Willie, we haven't seen any of this. BS, we have seen exactly this. Is it the Ukrainian forces doing it? No. Is there some backing of this? Absolutely. Look at the partisans working in Crimea. Look at them working inside Russia, blowing up train lines with IEDs. We've seen this inside Russia and Crimea twice or three times only over the past couple of days. Absolutely like that. We saw that bombing, that toy, or whatever it was, the present delivered inside Russia, killed that guy inside of the Wagner group, like maybe not the headquarters, but one of the areas. So we have things like that. Number four, propaganda and information warfare. Weaker actors may utilise propaganda, misinformation, and psychological operations to shape public opinion, gain support, or undermine the morale of the stronger adversary. Now, this one I think is the absolute most relevant to Ukraine. That Russia has been seen for decades as this absolute military superpower, and there's been so much negative propaganda against Russia for 50 years. Every PlayStation game, every movie, the bad guy is Russia, so it's easy to pin very bad things on them, and I'm not saying that is unwarranted. Look at some of the Russian history and look at Georgia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, and then we can start drawing the conclusions to that and use that in the sphere of informational warfare. The informational campaign around Ukraine has been the best informational campaign of all time, using rightfully ways to give Ukraine the advantage in the information space. If I asked you 2 years ago, what are the colours on the Ukraine flag, or pin in a globe where Ukraine is, 99% of you, including myself, could not have done that. Now, every single person in the world, whether you're pro or anti-Ukraine, can do that. It has been incredibly beneficial. It's been incredibly successful. So that is a massive one. And Russia's propaganda has been effective, but not even close to where Ukraine's is. Number five, blending with the civilian population. Non-state actors may hide among civilian populations, making it challenging for the stronger side to identify and target them without causing significant collateral damage or loss of civilian life. This tactic can also be used to exploit the rules of engagement and international public opinion. Now, there has been many cases of this actually on both sides, with people being within civilian populations. The thing is about civilian population and warfare, a lot of that was written when it was digging trenches out in the middle of nowhere and fighting it so hard with urban warfare of if you just set up a trench out here, you're just going to get fucking smoked. It's so easy. So it's been very difficult to do that. But non-state actors, things like partisans, militia groups, whatever, they're just in amongst the civilian population. How do you know? This is what, say, the Taliban was incredibly efficient at doing in Afghanistan, because there's the guy raking the field, next thing, AK, next thing, raking the field again. You know, this is, maybe they're not intentional, but done intentionally can be incredibly important, especially non-uniformed, things like that. So this is all part of what we're talking about. Now, asymmetric warfare is driven by the recognition that the traditional military advantage of a more powerful force can be offset by unconventional tactics, adaptability, and exploiting specific vulnerabilities. It requires a flexible and comprehensive approach to counter, as it often goes beyond traditional military solutions and involves political, economic, and social aspects. What has Ukraine been brilliant at? Political, economic, and social aspect, especially social. A lot of people who could never given a shit about what happened in 2014, couldn't tell you the blue and yellow flag, could not tell you a bit of history about Ukraine, and now have that flag in their Facebook, in their Twitter, and are full-time backing that. Economic. Zelensky, love him, hate him, is in the most powerful places in the world, getting weapons that we would never have dreamed to go on into Ukraine. And political, that sort of goes into that as well. And what is it? This flexible, comprehensive approach. And what is it? It is offsetting by these conventional tactics. Now, this is an intel update handed to me as well, and this is over the past really 48 hours. I was a little bit slow on this one, but I think this will gain into some of what we're talking about. The situation in Bakhmut remains tense, with the Russian Federation military forces replacing Wagner forces, who have been greatly reduced and now withdraw to the rear, reorganising and resupply the commencement of training reinforcement cycle of their personnel. So Wagner Group in and out, and Wagner Group as well. Love them, hate them, however, somewhat go into this asymmetric warfare we're talking about, at least more the higher end Wagner Group guys. And as I always say, there's really four sides to Wagner, but the two sides which are really relevant in Ukraine are the really well-trained guys and the mobilised guys from prisons or volunteers or something. You've really got two. Now, information is they all shall return to the area of operations, the AO. So they're all going to make a return. Now, will they then bolster the border in Belgorod? You and I have spoken about this on the other day. Next thing's talking about doing that. So that could absolutely be what's happening. War business. Now, the inexperience of the enemy replacement forces will obviously be the advantage of the Ukrainian armed forces will exploit and use shortly. So watch this space. Avdiivka has been stabilised. Salients created by the enemy in Spartak and the north of Krasnodarivka have seen some advances, and the enemy's attempts to increase command and control of these salient areas were repelled, and the enemy withdrew with losses. Vuhledar is stable with only very minor issues at the moment. Vuhledar, we're seeing another PMC in there as well, and I can talk about that if you'd like. There seems to be quite a few pauses on the south axis after Storm Shadow strikes on enemy logistics and command positions. People have discussed Belgorod operation in great detail in social media. A comment has been made by an army Donbass partisans commander, and I can't say his name. Anyone who wants to fight and assist Ukraine's conflict will receive training and assistance to do so, and that was always extended to Russian citizens, as has been discussed and shown over many years since 2014. The Russian government has always called these people traitors, of course, and if they decide to get together to take back what is theirs and ask for help from their own people to do so, then that is their prerogative, as they are citizens of that country fighting for justice, just as Ukrainians are. So talking about that rise up, and here we're talking about that as well. Partisans, salients, things like this. We're talking about these unconventional tactics, and at least they're using unconventional tactics in mixed with conventional warfare. We talk about the Storm Shadow, things like that. And we're going to talk about where asymmetrical meets conventional and how effective then that can be. But wait with me, because what are we, 24 minutes in? We've got a little bit to go. But I've been reading Sebastian Junger's Freedom. Now, if you haven't heard of Sebastian Junger, author, journalist, amazing. Tribe, this book, Tribe, pulled me out of a massive hole. Sorry to go personal on this, but when I was diagnosed with my tumour and I was losing my job, my commanding officer, my officer in command, actually gave me a version of Tribe. And was like, Willie, you should really read this, because I really know you're going through a spout of depression. This is after I talked to him about my diagnosis of anxiety and depression that I've overcome since then. But I was in a very hard place with my losing my career, something I loved, and also losing my life of the tumour. But at the end of the second book of Freedom, it's really made up of three, I think there is a bit that really we can relate to this conflict. Now, I had some involvement near the end of the Afghanistan campaign with a 9-month tour, but many of my friends served throughout the war from very beginning to the finish, and I had guys that were the last ones off the pavement as my mates as well. But I also think there's some elements that we can absolutely relate to Ukraine, as it's really started this think tank for me. So I'm just sort of out of exploring ideas. And as I've said earlier, these are not set in stone, and I'm happy to have my mind change either way. Knowledge and life experiences from other people is what you should be basing so much off. But the idea of these large conventional forces versus smaller guerrilla forces is really good in this. And throughout history, large forces that should be dominant have lost to driven, unconventional forces time and time again. So I thought I'd share little bits and pieces about this. So we're just going to have some screenshots of the book here as well. And by this book, I've got it here, it is bloody incredible. Now, the Ottomans boasted 12,000 men, including cavalry and artillery, and faced a mere 900 Montenegrins. The Montenegrins were unfazed and sent 3-man raiding parties out all night long before attacking at dawn, killing a third of the Ottoman army before the rest fled. The Ottomans invaded Montenegro several times over the next decade, each time more or less doubling the size of their army without ever achieving a lasting victory. After a major military defeat, the tribesmen simply operated in small guerrilla bands. Observers and anthropologist Christopher Baum of the Montenegrin defence strategy by burning crops and hiding away livestock and by cutting off the enemy's supply lines. They made certain that their rugged natural fortress could not be occupied permanently, except at an exorbitantly high cost. And let's talk about exorbitantly high costs. It's what we're seeing in Russia at the moment. The Montenegrins lived a locally autonomous life while their neighbours remained in bondage. It is a quality entirely unique to humans that a smaller entity like the Montenegrins could defeat a larger one. Were this not, freedom would effectively be impossible. Every group would be run by a single large male, and the world would be dominated by fascist megastates like the Ottomans that could easily crush insubordinate populations. Now, we're going to skip forward in the book here as well. I'm not giving you the bloody whole thing for free. But that's not what the world looked like. Large armies or people are stronger than small ones, but usually slower and less efficient. We talk about when Russia has been stuck at river crossings, they've got stuck on the massive convoys, things like that. This is very true at every scale, from open warfare to street corner fistfights, because the outcome of any human conflict cannot be predicted with certainty. The powerful often end up having to negotiate with the weak, and those negotiations invariably resolve around freedom. The basic dynamics of asymmetric conflict readily scale up. Insurgents like the Montenegrins cannot hope to beat a large conventional military in open combat, so they don't even try. Instead, they do what small athletes do. They stay mobile. They avoid standing toe-to-toe and trading blows. They strike only when they can get away. Conventional armies burn through more fuel, munitions, and food the same way that large fighters burn through more oxygen, and even wealthy nations can't afford to maintain that level of effort indefinitely. The logistical demands of a modern mechanised army are so enormous that most of its resources go into simply sustaining itself. No more than 1/3 of its soldiers are directly engaged in combat, and usually far less. Insurgents, on the other hand, are almost all engaged in combat, often including senior commanders, and they never have to win. They just have to keep not losing. I think this last line is a big thing for Ukraine as well. They don't have to win. Eventually, Russia's losses will become so enormous. The impact on the economy will be so large that then they will win, but they just have to keep not losing. Air power is also limited value against smaller forces. In fact, there is almost an inversion of ordinary military principles. The fewer enemy there are, the harder they are to kill and less likely they are to be defeated. A 1,000,000-man army can probably be destroyed faster than a 1,000-man insurgency because it's completely dependent on command hierarchy and resupply. Destroy those things and there is no army. Most insurgencies, on the other hand, are composed of semi-autonomous cells that are dependent on the society they live in. And targeting civilians is a war crime, and it also turns the populace against the invaders and drives them into the arms of the insurgents. Bombers and attack aircraft can drop devastating munitions on the battlefield, but they are easy for insurgents to avoid and incredibly costly to operate. There does not seem like enough jet fuel in the world to keep enough aircraft aloft to kill all the people who are willing to die fighting for them. After 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, the US found itself having to negotiate with an insurgency that lacked air power, tanks, heavy artillery, and sometimes even boots. A relatively small number of Taliban insurgents fought the most powerful military in the world to a standstill, and a prior generation of Afghans did the same thing to the Soviet Union. to the former Soviet Union, the Taliban represent an oppressive ideology that has almost no respect for human rights, but many insurgents are fighting for those rights. And if all insurgencies and uprisings were easily crushed, there would be no possibility for political change or freedom in the world, amongst other outcomes. The US would not exist. However, it is defined freedom is due in part to the fact that powerful nations do not always win wars, and powerful men do not always win fights. In fact, as often as not, they lose. So idiots are going to say, oh, you're comparing them to Afghan. No, just to the Taliban. No, I'm not. But we're talking about smaller groups being able to impact larger forces. Now, this is exactly how Russia, as said, was driven out of Afghanistan, well, it was the former Soviet Union, and as well as how we ended up arming the Taliban way further than we arrived. And not only arming, but training, because a lot of the guys that we trained ended up now joining, because what other option they bloody have? And this is also why Ukraine has had so much success against Russia, especially in the beginning. Ukraine has a lot of these independent groups. You've got foreign legion groups, which act completely independently, and you've got all these other groups. Some of them work with ideologies, and some are just completely there to win the war. So, of course, it is in these asymmetric events where we have seen Ukraine, a smaller force, absolutely thrive. The use of highly mobile anti-armor teams taking out tank columns, then disappearing. The use of partisans in both Ukrainian occupied territory and then within Russian territory, especially as of late. The use of cheap disposable drones, apps to help track missiles used by the public, even at the Molotov cocktails, armed groups with plausible deniability, separate from the state, moving into Russian territory, that creates a PR nightmare. So we go back into that political, economical, social aspect as well. And information campaigns and raising online communities to entice then Russian soldiers to surrender. And all this can be absolutely a snowball. The most deadly militaries are those that can implement asymmetric warfare in conjunction with conventional weapons. Now, this is very advanced, and I don't know of any military in large does it really well. And I'm talking in massively large, except with the exception of SF units, but special force units aren't that big. You know, they're not out there operating 1,000 tanks. But ultimately, and it's taken us, 30-something minutes. Ultimately, my point is don't fight Russia at its own game. Open battlefields, tanks, air, navy is where they would prefer to fight. But as we found out, the West in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and let's just name a few, asymmetric done correctly can absolutely help a smaller force drive out a larger force, to the point at which, for the larger force, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. My old commander used to say that, and we hated it, but I thought it was relevant in this, and could drive potential larger forces withdrawal. I think the focus on developing a conventional military in wartime is a massive ask, and I'd say that don't abandon what we know absolutely works. But again, this is just me talking shit. I think this is the reason why we've not seen these Western tanks and vehicles actually come into play yet. But we're seeing tactics used that the West has learnt the hard way, and we learnt asymmetric warfare by losing wars. And we're seeing that implemented. We're testing that as well. But we also haven't seen these modern weapons used yet. So we might be softening them up with this and then hit hard areas with those Western weapons as well. But don't for a second think that this push for this offensive hasn't started. Now, Russia should have learnt these lessons in Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, the beginning of Ukraine, and they haven't learnt those lessons, and that is a command and control issue. The big problem is if they start learning that and ways to counter it, even then, such a large force, so much logistics. Like we said, it's easier to defeat a 1,000,000-man army than a 1,000-man insurgency, and there's all these 1,000-man groups working in Ukraine as well. Separate from the Ukrainian armed forces, typical soldiers, you've got all these different units working as well, and even the Foreign Legion falls somewhat under that. But I hope this wasn't too different from my usual stuff, but I've just been really busy, and I was just fucking demotivated as hell from YouTube. So I just wanted to get on, talk about this, maybe learn something myself, maybe teach you guys something. And I think it's important in this, because then we can start peering through the bullshit of some of the propagandas of what Leopard 2s are just going to go all the way to Moscow, because that's not going to happen. They're running out of fuel. But either way, guys, thank you so much. If you'd like to support me, just links below. But I really, really appreciate it, but never feel like you need to send me a cent. But look after yourselves. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll speak to you soon. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.